Okay, I'll start accepting.
Hello, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining with us again. Welcome back to our regular events, pranks. This is our 74. I'm Resuli. I'm board member PMI Indonesia chapter. Okay, today our prank topic is networking and leadership. Change your life with meaningful connection based on shared purpose. This topic will be bring on by our speaker, Jim Emerick. So I will introduce our speaker tonight. It's very honor to having you, uh, Jim. Hello, Jim. How are you?
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah. Okay. I will introduce about Jim. Jim is a founder and president. Choi. Is it right? The spell. Okay. Jim is a academy leadership master facilitator, and Jim has facilitated leadership events in person and virtual across 12 countries, yeah, reaching over 2,000 professional. And so Jim is a alumni of the U.S. Air Force Academy. Yeah, he served the technology program manager, developing and integrating next generation spacecraft computer into more than 50 platforms. In 1992, James co-founded and led Innovative System and Technology Corporation, pioneering three big breakthrough generation of radio frequency system on chip with diverse teams from the US, Scotland, and Canada. Also, Jim is served as a vice president advanced technology at ITT, delivering the next generation communication platform technology and establishing the information assurance like SCADA and capability. Okay, before we start, our participant will be on mute and video turn off. If you have a question, submit in chat box, and session will be recorded. E-certificate will be distributed to all participants who join the session. Auto submission video is exclusive for the PMI Indonesia chapter member only. The recording will be uploaded to YouTube channel. You can search in PMI Indonesia chapter. At least, but not less, happy learning and give us feedback. Okay, Jim. Now it's time for you. Thank you. Okay.
All right. Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Hello, good evening.
How's this screen look good?
Yes. Already.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you to the whole team there. We've been working on this for, I think, half a year. I think this started with Mohammed. David's been involved, you, Rasuli, BMO running the Zoom. So I really appreciate this. It's kind of fun to do this. This is meant to be a fun talk, and to the extent we can do it, certainly by the use of the chat box, I want this to be interactive. So that was a nice introduction. Well, a fun way to think about what I do right now is I'm a former military officer, and I do many different things, but most of what I do these days is I facilitate leadership programs, just as Rashuli was saying, all over. But let me tell you how the origins, or how the idea of this talk about networking and leadership actually started. It started about 6 years ago. And I was a trustee for my daughter's school when she was in high school before university. And the school asked me if I could talk to a group of the graduates, of the alumni. I wasn't sure what I would talk about, but I thought about it. And the more I thought about it, and remember, this is well before COVID, was even though all these young men, young women graduated from high school, they had all this technology, and they'd been using all these technology platforms since they were kids, but I don't think they really knew how to communicate with each other. And I don't think they had a very good definition of networking. And when I gave my talk to them, it was at a microbrewery. So it was a very relaxed environment. And there was a room full of the graduates, but the ones who I think really listened the most were the parents. That there were a couple parents there. And I realized something interesting was going on with this talk. Then in 2020, 3 years ago, when COVID was closing everything up, I noticed that other groups had formed, and a particular group here in the United States was a lady military networking group, and they were trying to stay connected even though they were all working from home, and they had lost some of that connection. So I modified my talk for the COVID environment, and that's largely what we have today. But a couple things. One is I really like the name PRANKS because you're focused on knowledge. You'll see that this talk addresses that right away. And the other thing is I just want to make sure that we have a question and answer session at the end of this. You don't have to save your questions for that. So anyone who can help monitor the chat box, I'm watching it also. Because of the COVID environment, I've become pretty familiar with Zoom. so anyway, if you need to raise your hand, to do something, introduce your question, go ahead and interrupt me along the way.
Okay.
So here's what we're going to cover.
I will support to, if there is a question, I will support to inform.
So here's what we're going to do. We're going to go back in time a little bit, and I want to start with capturing some of our thoughts about what we think networking really means today. And then I'm going to go back and share some experiences from back when I was a program manager, when I was in the military, when I was going to school, probably like many of you, and how I learned, to me, a very valuable definition of networking, and I think it had a lot to do with things I was successful at for a period of time. So that's what I really want to do. It's mostly a storytelling adventure, and then we'll come up maybe with a better definition of networking that we can use today. And I'll tell you a couple more stories about how I've used this new model in recent years. So that's what we're going to do. So hopefully we'll get some fun out of this. I will share these this slide deck with you in a PDF form. I'll get that compressed a little bit and off to you. But anyway, that's what we're going to do today. So let's do this. Go ahead and throw some words out in the chat box just to kick this off. What do you think when you hear the word networking? Go ahead and put something in the chat box. We'll come back to this later, but I want to capture some first thoughts. So let's go ahead and put in the chat box what we think about when we hear the word networking. Okay. Hearing a lot about making connections. That's good. Keep going. Let's see what else we got. About a couple more. Okay, now we're sharing experiences and exchanging ideas. This is good. Interaction. Okay, we'll return to that in a little bit. And if you got any more thoughts, go ahead and drop them in there. But I think we got enough to start with here. So what we can find, what's very interesting, and think about the COVID environment. People putting on there that we want to make a connection and interact. And look what Brené Brown puts on this quote. She's a pretty good author and she's a pretty good coach. And she finds that, and remember, this was written before COVID. So I found very similar things working with people like you, professionals across the world for over 10 years. It seems like a lot of us have lost the ability to make the connection or to connect with each other in a meaningful way. And look at the two words that are highlighted there. People are disengaged, and some of them feel they've lost a sense of purpose. And I'll share something with you. When people come to my leadership classes, it's almost always followed up by coaching sessions. In fact, I have 3 coaching sessions today. I have one with a credit union president, and I have 2 other ones. And before COVID, in a coaching session, professionals like you, maybe 15 to 20% of them would talk about wanting to change jobs or career or a life change. And it usually had to do with not liking the boss or not feeling like you were being recognized or appreciated, but it's stronger today. Even though we're not in the COVID environment anymore, I would say that 30% of my coaching sessions now, people are talking about the same types of things that we see here that Brené Brown was writing about. And the word I'm hearing more this year than any other is lack of fulfillment. Many times people are being told you must come back to the office, and sometimes they say back to work rather than back to office, almost implying that if you were at home working, you weren't really working. So there's a lot of disengagement. There's something going on there. And let's keep in mind those 2 terms, engagement and purpose. Mark Crowley wrote an interesting book called Lead from the Heart. And last year, he produced a 2nd edition of the book. And it's got some really good stuff in it. He finds that even leading research today shows that there's an actual physical connection between the heart and the mind. And it's things like the vagus nerve, stuff like that. And he ties 4 different factors: organizational health, managerial quality, extrinsic rewards, and workplace readiness. He ties those 4 things to 67% of engagement. And we'll revisit that again later, but I want to introduce that. because what we're actually feeling inside actually affects us in the workplace. So this isn't just a fuzzy thing. This is something that anyone in a leader role needs to be aware of with others. So the combination of what Brene Brown was sharing and the combination of what Mark Crowley is writing about is pretty important. I don't know if any of you have ever been here to the States and visited the Air Force Academy. This is an actual picture of the Air Force Academy. I went to, that was university for me, a military university. And that's what it looks like in the winter. Okay. And it's very interesting. In the spring of 2020, 3 years ago, when everyone was locking down, I'm not sure if it was the same out there in Jakarta as it was here in the States, but some of the first institutions that closed were universities. The largest 3 military universities in the United States are West Point, the military academy, the Naval Academy, and the Air Force Academy. The Naval Academy and West Point, basically the Army Military Academy, they closed completely. They sent all the cadets home. The Air Force Academy did something different. The Air Force Academy asked that the seniors, the ones who were going to graduate and become officers next, the seniors were required to stay. And when you're a couple months away from graduating from a service academy, guess what? How do you think you feel at that time of your life? It's super exciting. You're going to graduate soon. You're going to become a military officer. It's very prestigious. You're very excited. You've worked very hard. This should be one of the most vibrant, exciting times in your life. So, but the school put down a lot of restrictions. People had to be in their rooms by themselves. They couldn't be with their roommate. They couldn't eat their meals with anybody. And who can guess, use the chat box if you want to guess, who can guess what happened within a few weeks after this policy was adopted in the spring of 1920? Guess what happened? Let's see if anyone's got a guess. Take a guess, Rasuli. What do you think happened?
After finish the academy, maybe look different what we think after different, yeah, different thing that actual condition.
Here's what happened. Here's what happened. Okay, and it's pretty dramatic. The first cadet killed himself. Okay, they were so isolated. They were so isolated, and this was not in the newspapers. This was very quiet. So you have someone who's maybe 20, 21 years old in the best time of their life, the most exciting and promising time of their life, was so isolated and disconnected from people, they killed themselves. And then 2 weeks later, the second suicide. And that got everyone's attention. Not so much the first one, but when they saw that they had a pattern. And not all of a sudden now, this was in the local newspapers, and that's what the local newspaper had said. It said it had been prison-like for those cadets. And so even if you have someone who's been through a lot of military training, who's highly educated and has all the promise in the world, if you completely isolate them and disconnect them from others, you're creating huge human risks. So all of a sudden, everyone had to pay attention to that policy, and they had to realize, what did we do here? And this really brought it home for me. When I heard about the first suicide, I even thought maybe that was one person who something was just wrong with them. But after the second one, I had to stop and think about it. What is going on here? Something very powerful is going on here. So that's a good thing to think about. There's a really good question here in the chat box. Let's take a look at that. It seems difficult to have a job again after layoff and collapse of companies. Many job hunters build connections by networking. Many misunderstanding definition about networking. What's your opinion? That's what this talks about. In one way I think I can answer this question is that I think many of us take the idea of networking, we don't take it deep enough, and we're not connecting to the types of issues that I just described. We're not talking about matters from the heart. We don't go deep enough. And I think that's part of what's missing right now. So we'll come back to that, but it's exactly the type of thing we should be thinking about is how can we make the best possible connections? So it's not just a superficial thing. Can we address the real issues that we're thinking about in a very interesting environment? So if we look again one more time to...
Ya udah ini aja record, mana nggak laku dia, nggak ketawa
Sorry.
dia.
Please,
Aha, someone's got a little one.
Jurusnya udah nggak mau
someone.
makan.
Wait, I will stop the. Wait. I need
Dia bisa
to.
I
merangkak.
think we need to,
Yeah,
I think we need to mute there.
Pak Mas Bimo bisa ini.
All right.
Ya, oke.
The way we
Sorry.
actually engage with people, just like the question that Andrew put in the chat box, is how we're making those connections probably has a stronger effect than anything else. If you think about it, this has stronger than parenting. But I think we could also say maybe the way we connect, that could be more important, say, than what our educational levels are, what our credentials are. It has to do more with the people connection. Again, when we're talking about engagement. So that's a pretty interesting thought. And for a group of highly trained program managers, this might be something new. So a fun idea is, how can we think about this? And here's one fun way to do this. I think this is a really good single page to think about what networking could become. Look at all the intersections that we have to create before we get to a sense of purpose. We could have, notice that where you see career, or you see profession, or you see vocation. All of those things are good, but they don't touch everything. They don't hit that middle part. And how many of us actually spend time on this? How many of us spend time reflecting on this? You know, that question in the chat box, how can we get closer to connecting in the middle? Look at the top one where it says what I love. We hear about this all the time. You know, find what you love to do and do that and you'll be happy. Well, if nobody wants it and nobody's going to pay for it, it's going to be kind of tough and you might not become fulfilled. So that, I think what happened in COVID, and maybe we haven't recovered from it yet, is all of us probably got bumped. You know, if we were close to the middle or if we got near the middle, maybe the COVID environment shifted us away from there. And the whole idea is what can we do to get closer to that? And can we use this as a way to think about not just improving our connections with people, but also becoming a better leader? Any thoughts about that? Let's do this. Let's go ahead and I'm going to share some stories. Now, if we go back all the way to 1990, right? I'm giving you, know, I'll be 60 years this old, okay? 60 years old this year. In 1990, 33 years ago, okay, I was probably something like doing things like you were. I was I have an electrical engineering degree from university. I'm a program manager. I'm helping develop advanced technology for the Air Force. It's kind of fun. But here's the part I want to focus on. I'm also going to school. I'm going back to school at the same time to get my MBA, because I wanted to learn about business, because I thought it would be fun to start a business. So I wanted to try some things. And we had a guest speaker. His name was Doug. His name's on top of the slide. And he had started a company. And remember, this is before we're using widespread email. We're not really using the web. I was on the ARPANET, you know, when it was in its primitive state, but basically we weren't doing email. This is when you would still go to a library to do your research to write a paper. And this guy, Doug, he said, if there's something that you're really interested in, he said, go find the Encyclopedia of Associations. That was his advice to us. Go find the Encyclopedia of Associations and connect with people who have a common interest with you, right? A common passion or mission, not necessarily something you're going to get paid for, but something you have a common passion for, and see what you can do. So I liked that idea, and I wanted to write a paper. So I wanted to write a paper. This was the time in the United States when we were just starting to do things such as curbside recycling, where you take a big plastic garbage bin and you have a separate one. Sometimes it's blue, and you put it in front of your house, right? We'll do that Sunday night for Monday in a few days. So I wanted to understand, does that make economic sense? Can you build a business around that? Can you do something that's good for the environment and also have a business at the same time? So I called it market opportunities in recycling. Or another way is, I was trying to find something I was passionate about. Was there a mission there? Could this be a calling? Is this something I could really get excited about? And what I did was I used that Encyclopedia of Associations. And this is the interesting part. There's no social media. There's no email, right? This was snail mail. So I went into that Encyclopedia of Associations. And if there's something you're interested in, and I was interested in this recycling study, I found out that there's all kinds of organizations. So I literally, in fact, I remember using WordPerfect for this on my computer. I sent out hundreds of letters, right? Think about how we use social media today and how superficial that can be. So I'm writing these letters. A lot of them are to agencies in Washington, D.C., but I'm also writing them to state capitals, 50 states in the United States. And I'm basically saying, hey, I'm interested in learning more about what you're doing. You know, it looks like we got a common passion. You're at this association and that's trying to do good stuff with recycling. I really like to learn about that. And again, many of these people weren't being paid for it, or maybe it's part of their job or not part of that job. And guess what their response was? Look at the picture there. What I realized was, if you actually wrote a letter, and that's the way you corresponded then, and you let someone know you were genuinely interested in what they were doing, they're going to send you something back. And I got so much mail back. It wasn't quite that big, but the mail we got back, and there were envelopes and pamphlets. I was able to fill boxes. I was able to fill boxes of material. And my advisor for that paper, when I turned it in, I turned that paper in about market opportunities in recycling. I had indices. I filled 2 fat binders of material. My advisor said, Jim, I believe you've done 2 courses, not just one. He said, I'm going to award you an additional grade as though you took the class twice. And that taught me a great lesson. That taught me a huge lesson, that when we share our curiosity or our love of something in a genuine way, that's what's going to provoke someone. That's going to create engagement when we share that kind of story with somebody. And even though we have all these tools to do that today, the social media, I don't believe we tend to do that anymore. When I have almost 8,000 connections on LinkedIn, and almost anyone who connects with me on LinkedIn, for example, doesn't connect with me usually about exploring what their shared passion is. Usually they're trying to sell me something, or they're trying to find out who I'm connected to so they can try to sell something to them, right? It tends to be much more superficial. Any thoughts so far about that? So let's go a little bit further then. And got a question for the chat box? Go ahead and throw it in. So remember, I'm a junior officer then. I'm thinking of starting a business. In 1992, this is actually why I moved to Florida. I leave the military, I come to Florida, and we start a little company. And a lot of times when you start a little company, you don't really know what you're doing. I was only 28. I don't think we knew what we were doing very much. But eventually, I took over the company we started, and we started developing, we were integrated circuit designers, chip designers. And if you want to be a good chip designer, a good integrated circuit designer, it's good to have knowledge of the semiconductor physics for the foundry process you want that chip manufactured in. And if any of you were around in the late 1990s, what was happening then? What was happening 1995 to 2000? What was happening economically?
Crisis. Is it? Crisis
We were having the
economic?
internet boom then. Right. There were, remember
Uh,
the internet? There was the internet boom. Everyone wanted to start the internet company. Everyone wanted bandwidth. Everyone wanted high-speed connections. Now, some of the really bright engineers in our company, they were telling me, Jim, IBM has a new manufacturing process. It's based on silicon germanium. This picture here is a picture of IBM's T.J. Watson Research Center in New York. And there are, at the time, there were 2,000 PhDs working there. So you could call that the IBM Brain Trust. So you have all these very, very smart people there. And remember that lesson I learned. What if we connect with someone? What if we share common purpose and things like that? Well, it turns out I made a connection with a gentleman named Dr. Dean Herman. And Dr. Dean Herman was a 1960 graduate of West Point. So he had graduated from university 27 years before me. I'm probably 32 at the time, or 33 or something like that. And he's probably the age I'm at now. He's about 60. And he worked for Dr. Bernie Meyerson, the person who invented a new semiconductor process based on silicon germanium. And the very interesting thing about this semiconductor process was it was probably the first time there was a semiconductor process available where you could marry designs in both the analog and the digital domain. You could put an entire communication system into a single piece of silicon. But the thing is, nobody knew how to do that yet, right? So I connected with Dr. Dean Herman, Dr. Bernie Meyerson. You could say we had a lot of shared passions. I made a proposition to Dean Herman, and I said, hey, let's get to know each other, right? I'm going to come visit you every few months. We'll talk about anything we want. We'll go out, we'll have a great dinner. We'll drink some great scotch. I wanted it to be a very fun relationship. I didn't just call him to say, I want your technology. And the fun part was we've both been military officers. So over time, guess what happened? I ended up asking Dean Herman, I said, what are you doing with that really neat semiconductor process? And he said, you won't believe this, Jim. Nobody wants to use it for what it can do. In fact, he told me that they were under contract by Nortel Networks in Canada to actually change the recipe. To change the recipe, not so it could be an integrative technology, but simply so that the transistors could switch on and off very fast because everyone wanted high bandwidth, high speed things. So this is a true story. So I told him, hey, we would love to use your technology, to create, the world's first revolutionary chips where you could marry both the analog and the digital domain. And Dean told me no one even knows how to do that. No one has built out the design kits to do that. I raised my hand again and think about that. We're over dinner. We're pretty relaxed, right? We probably had a half bottle of scotch. And then I basically told Dean Herman, I said, look, we'll do that for you. You can, we'll be the ones who build out the design kits. And understand, I'm the company president, right? I'm the CEO. I'm not even sure if our team knows how to do this. So anyway, IBM hires us. IBM hires us, and we become the first company in the world to actually create an RF, or a radio frequency system on chip. There's a picture of it. You'll never see that picture anywhere because this isn't something I've shared very much. That's a test chip. That's a test chip. We called it Emerald. And you can see there's 6 different chips there. If you look closely, you can see the analog part, the lower rectangle, and then you can see the digital electronics. There's a lot of unique things about here. But I'm pretty sure that when we made that, that was probably the most advanced chip in the world. And one of the reasons why I knew we had really created something interesting is we would do this in a secure design environment. We would encrypt the design, and then we would digitally stream the design to IBM. This particular test chip was so dense, it had so many transistors in it, that when we streamed the design to IBM, and IBM has a very sophisticated manufacturing process, guess what happened? Their servers crashed. Their servers crashed because the design was so big. They actually had to upgrade. They had to upgrade their system just to accept this complex design to build. So anyway, and it's a fun story, but look at what's on top. What I believe really happened here, and understand there was no social media, there was no LinkedIn. This was phone calls. This was multiple visits. This was getting to know somebody. This is building a relationship with a fellow innovator, where we really discovered we had a true passion for something. So IBM was happy. Understand, IBM paid our little company to do this, right? And I knew something special was happening. We created 3 generations of this over a period of maybe 5 years, and we were far ahead of anyone else in the world to do anything like this. In fact, if you go to the Apple website to order a laptop or something like that, or a desktop, an iMac or something, and when it asks you to choose the processor you want, it won't say processor, it'll say system on chip. and these were the world's really first truly integrated systems on chip. But understand, this was happening over 20 years ago, right about 20, 21, 22 years ago when we were doing this. So that's the power, right? That's the power of genuine networking when we find a shared purpose. That's the real big takeaway there. So now I call this networking and leadership, right? So that's kind of some of the networking part, and it's a fun story, and I'm kind of proud of what our little company did. By the way, guess which was the first company that tried to buy ours? 4 companies tried to buy our little company. Shouldn't be a surprise which the first one was. It was IBM, right? That should make sense. IBM was the first company that tried to purchase us. Now let's fast forward. I like this picture here. Let's fast forward to about 2015. What can we take from those stories I just shared with you? What can we take? How can we apply that to leading, or to motivating others, or creating a really neat environment? Many attendees who come to leadership programs I facilitate are PMPs like you. And how many of you work in a matrixed environment? You might be responsible for a project, but the people who are on the project, you might not have direct authority over them, right? And I think that's a really common thing for a lot of you. So how do you make that work? And many times you'll hear in a business article, or you'll read about it in a paper like the Wall Street Journal, it'll say, hey, if we get everybody aligned and behind a strategy, let's have one common strategy, everything will work. But research tells us that's not good enough. What's very interesting is when managers are surveyed, only 90% of them, they're fine with their own teams, but when they have to rely on someone else, like in a matrixed environment, it's when there's a dependency on another function or another part of the organization, that's where things tend to break down. And look at that, only 9% of them say they can rely on the other managers all the time. So it's not just a question of aligned strategy. I think it also means that there's a more complex working relationship for a lot of us. And maybe there's something that we can do about that. So now this talk, right? We called your title for what we're doing is pranks, and I love that because part of the pranks term, right? The project management knowledge sharing is I want to talk to you about knowledge a little bit. Take a look at that book title there on the left, The Knowing Doing Gap. That is a very powerful book. It's not a new book. It's a book written by a couple guys, smart guys at Stanford University about 20 years ago. And what they call the knowing doing gap is many times in an organization, everyone might know what the right thing to do is. Let's say something controversial is happening or someone is acting improperly or unethically or breaking the law. Many times, no one will do anything. Or let's say if the organization knows what to do, or people in the organization know what to do, they still won't do it. And that's the gap, the knowing doing gap. So Pfeffer and Sutton found they wanted to see if they could find any organizations in the world that had crossed the knowing doing gap. And they didn't find that many. They didn't find that many. One of them they found was the New Zealand Post, and there's a picture there on the bottom. But every organization that crossed the knowing doing gap all had something in common with the way they treated knowledge. And what do you think that is? What do you think all those organizations did? It's very simple, but they did something very different with knowledge. Throw something in the chat box or raise your hand if you think you got an idea. Any takers? Who's got a thought about this? Think about that term knowledge sharing. Every organization that crossed the knowing doing gap treated knowledge as an active process, not something to hoard or store or warehouse or to hide from anyone, to share it in as rapidly as possible, as comprehensively as possible. And think about that. If you're going to have an environment where that can happen, I like to think here in the States, I like to think of Federal Express, FedEx. I'm not sure how, or with say Amazon Prime. You know, my front door to the house is about 10, 15 feet away from me. And I'll get a delivery from Amazon Prime. I won't even hear the package being set outside my front door, but I'll get a picture of it and I'll get a text and it says your package has been delivered. And every time that happens, I look and say, holy cow, how'd they do that so fast, right? How'd they do that? They took a picture of it and I got a picture of it and it might be 10 feet away. Someone came up to the door, I didn't hear them, and they just dropped the package. That's probably an organization that has a pretty good active process for sharing knowledge to where it's throughout the whole organization. I like to think about that. The New Zealand Post, what they did, and that was one of the organizations that they cited in the book. And that's a very hard book to find. I actually had to find, see that picture in the middle? That's a rare bookseller in New Zealand. And that's where I found the book. And so they sent it to me. So it's really hard to get that book. But what happened in the New Zealand Post, the post office in New Zealand also crossed the knowing doing gap. Because years ago, and it's a really great story, the post office in New Zealand was losing so much money that the government was going to close it down. And they brought in some folks to see if they could help. and they had a really neat new leader, a maverick guy, and he simply talked to all of the drivers who are driving all these trucks and cars that are going all over the land, and said, hey, what can we do? We're losing money. We're losing tens of millions of dollars per year. What can we do? And they knew the answer. No one had ever asked them. They said, you charge by weight. You charge by weight for all the stuff we deliver. And you can't predict what something's going to weigh, and you can't predict the volume, what the volume of it's going to be. Why don't we just come up with standard packages like flat rate packaging? We use flat rate packaging. I use it almost every day. Why don't we just standardize the packages, and then we'll know how many of any container can fit, whether it's a truck or an airplane, and then we can set the price based on that, and we can dial in how much money we make. And boom, they went from losing money to the next year they made tens of millions of dollars and completely turned the organization around. So anyway, that's what we want to do. We can think about knowledge differently, and I think everyone here already does that because you've got the superb PRANKS format, but I think we can go further. In my opinion, from all my leadership training and watching people become successful, I think one of the least understood or practiced leadership traits is knowledge sharing. I think any of us can get better at that, and I think it's a very good practice if we create a knowledge sharing environment. It's a great way to innovate, like the story I was telling you about what we did with our little company. But anyway, think about knowledge sharing. It's a fun way to do that. So we didn't sell our little company to IBM. We almost did, but we sold it to another company called ITT. And I didn't know that story about the knowing doing gap then, but I did know the power of connecting because I had done that before. And in a way, I was doing maybe what General Stanley McChrystal was doing in Team of Teams. What I realized was if I made a deep connection with all of the other people in the big company I joined, that's a picture there in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And that's the headquarters of the organization, the larger company that bought our little company. And I wanted to make those strong connections we've been talking about. And in fact, all of the vice presidents or directors that were my peers, whether it was operations or HR, engineering, legal, finance, the general manager, business development, IT, and security, all of those were my peers. And I thought that if I could have a deep connection with all of them, then it would be a better chance that the acquisition of our little company would be more successful and everyone would be more happy. And it's interesting because the two groups that I thought I was going to have, one of the groups I thought I was going to have the most trouble with was human resources. I thought I was going to have a lot of trouble there because our organization had a different culture from the headquarters. The people in our little company were very highly paid, and I thought that was going to cause some conflict. And it turns out, because I built really strong affinities, the human resources relationship turned out to be one of the strongest ones. But it was all based on the idea of creating those strong connections that we've been talking about. I was at that site probably every 7 to 10 days for 3.5 years because I wanted to make strong personal connections. I didn't want to rely on email. No one used Zoom or anything like that then, but that's what we did. So those are that's a really good example, the knowledge sharing aspect, crossing the knowing doing gap as a way to build on this. Let's see. I'm looking at another question there, talking about classical hierarchical structured organizations.
Yes, there's a question.
Yes, and it's a question about hierarchy where there's traditionally people might not pay attention to you. Some of my coworkers pretend to look smarter to attract attention, to raise salary or position. How do we handle people like these? A couple things, and this comes up in coaching sessions a lot. We can often elevate the way we're seen, even by those higher authority positions. But what we'll probably have to do is we're going to have to make sure that we're expressing genuine strategic curiosity in the organization in a way that can get their attention. That's one way to do it. And another one is with techniques like we're just sharing here, or techniques if you do a leadership class with me, sometimes we'll have to create just our own environment or a cultural oasis where we can take care of our teams, and we may not be able to affect others around us. Let's say we have a lousy boss, or let's say we're in a hierarchy like this question describes, where no one may care what we're doing. If we're left alone, we can probably do just fine, but we'll have to know what our sphere of practical influence is. That's what we'll need to do. So there's techniques to do that. And this doesn't happen only in your country. There's plenty of those still here in the United States. So don't think it's just purely a cultural thing. It might be stronger there in your part of the world, but there's many companies that have that sense. In a way, this ITT company that bought our little company, it had its own fair share of that too. So those are a couple things that we can do. So let's move ahead. I'm gonna ask some questions here. I want to get us to think about how we can maybe change what we focus on. Let's call this a classical question, right? Should leaders focus on people, or should leaders focus on results? I suspect that with the training and the experience of this group, I think you're like me. I bet you have had a lot of training to focus on results. You've got PMP certifications, we've got other certifications, we have all of these degrees. I've got military training, some of you probably do too. So, haha, now this is fun. I like this. People first, vision first. Matt Lieberman did a really interesting study. And he wanted to find out if we tend to focus on people, what percentage of the time are we seen as a great leader? Okay. So give me a number, put some numbers in the chat box. What percentage, 1 to 100, what percentage of the time are we seen as a great leader when we're focusing on people? Say not the result, but people, like the box there says people first. What percentage of the time? Take a guess. You might be surprised. 30%, not bad. How about another one? Focus for, okay, 40, 35, focus for result, but takes more time, 60. All right, take a look at this. It's only 12% of the time. Holy cow, look at that. That's a low number. Now, sometimes when people are results oriented and not people oriented, they look at this and they laugh and say, see, it's just the results that matter. So let's ask the other question. When we focus on results, but not people, what percentage of the time are we seen as a great leader? How does it change? And I'll give you a hint. I'll give you a hint. It does go up. $75, $35, $90. All right, I don't know if everyone's seen anyone put 90 there before. Look at that. It goes up, but barely. It goes up, but barely. And think of both of those numbers, 12% and 14%. Those are both really low, aren't they? Those aren't very high. They're not very high at all. So this is really interesting. And I think this is a really good paper to research. So, I have the source there and the link. It's a Harvard Business Review article. But here's the more interesting part now. Now, I think I got your attention. What happens in a leader role when we can focus on both? Now, what happens to that number, the 12 and the 14%? Perfect leader. I love that answer. I love that answer. How about a number? It's not 100, okay? It goes up. What's it go up to? $45. moving in the right direction. It's actually a little bit more than that. It's more than 45, Mohammed. It jumps all the way to 72%. So think about that. If we're focused on one, people or the results, but separately, if they're broken apart, it's a low number. And if we can actually do both, our effectiveness as a leader skyrockets. That's why I like to share this. Now, here's maybe the most interesting question of all. What percentage of leaders actually focus on both in a genuine way? Which ones actually focus on both? What percentage of leaders focus on both? Because you can probably guess it's not a big number. Take a guess. 15, 20. Well, remember, we had 12 and 14 for individually, okay? But look at this, it's very small. It's less than 1%. Or put another way, almost nobody does it. That's why I'm sharing this with you. I believe that if we've been highly trained, let's say we're subject matter experts, we got master's degrees, we got PhDs, all these, let's say we're very smart and highly trained. And guess what? It's easier to measure results than effects on people. Right? How do you build KPIs for people? They're tougher. So if we've been trained to focus on results, and we can start also focusing on people, and that's a big part of what networking ought to be, then we're going to change our effectiveness dramatically, and almost nobody else does it. And I think that's like that's one of the most special things I want to share with this group. And this is the kind of focus I bring, to my leadership courses, because I want everyone to know how this works. This is what happened. This is what happened to me in my own little company. When I focused on making the connections with people who had access to the great technology, everything changed. And we became very successful. So I'm going to play about a 2-minute audio clip. It's not long. I'm going to play about a 2-minute audio clip. And I want you to hear this. This is from Mark Crowley. Remember, I mentioned before, he writes in his book, he makes a very quantitative claim. He says that there are 4 factors that lead to 67% of employee engagement. He says it's organizational health, managerial quality, extrinsic rewards, and workplace readiness. But the one I'm curious about is managerial quality. I'm talking with a group of professional managers here, and I want you to hear this answer because I think it's dynamite. Okay, someone give me a thumbs up or let me know you're able to hear it. I believe the sound's on, so let's try this for 2 minutes, but let me know you can hear it.
I think some of what you just said corresponds to the 4 drivers you say explain 67% of overall movement of employee engagement: organizational health, managerial quality, extrinsic rewards, and workplace readiness. Talk to us a little bit about managerial quality.
Managerial quality?
Yes.
Tell me a little bit more about what you're looking for, and I'll make sure that I give you a good answer.
What is it, and what can be done within that factor to improve employee engagement?
I think the biggest thing that if organizations could make one change that could have the biggest impact, I think it would be in making the firm decision that they're no longer going to hire people into management roles at any level where that person doesn't have a track record of elevating other people. Meaning that in the interview you say, well, Jim, tell us 2 or 3 people that have worked for you that through efforts of your own initiative, you helped grow into more senior roles than where they came from. Some people are just completely stumped and can't give you an answer. Some will try to fake an answer because you need one in the interview. But what you're really looking for is, I have people who work for me, and this is what my plan is to elevate them. This is how I teach them. This is how I grow them. This is how I give them opportunities that match up to their career aspirations. Here's how I recognize them. Here's how I made them feel comfortable and safe. These kinds of things is really the greatest impact on engagement as far as I can tell.
Pretty neat, huh? I think that's one of the best examples of focusing on people as a priority, in addition to focusing on results. And notice how that firm decision he describes has nothing to do with some of the subject matter expertise, nothing about their own individual accomplishments. It's about their service and support of developing others. And I think that's a lot of what this talk is all about. So let's go back. Let's go back to those first thoughts we had about networking, because, you know, a lot of us, we're talking about connections, interactions, point of view of each other, exchanges and interaction. I want to focus on what I don't think networking really ought to do, right? The superficial things, because these are some of the thoughts we have when we think about networking, or I think why networking sometimes gets a bad name. And in the end, many people think of networking as nothing more than asking for a job. But I don't think, in light of everything we've covered so far and ways to grow as a leader, I don't think that's good enough. And I think COVID has really amplified that. So here's my definition. Okay, I didn't find this anywhere. I made this up, but I think this is a better definition. And tell me what you think about this. I think it's a habit. I think it's something we do all our lives, but it's connecting with and helping others who have a common purpose. That's what I think it's about. And I think if we use a definition like this, we can create fantastic relationships. But not only that, we can do things like help others. We can build really interesting companies. And I think we can have a lot more success in our both personal and professional lives. So how are we doing on time? Because we got till 8:30, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Already.
Okay,
Yes. It's okay. I think it's okay.
Okay. Yeah, we're good. I'm gonna so guess what happens? Guess what happens when we actually do this? Let's say when we use this different form of networking. I'll share two stories. Okay. I'll share two stories. In 2010, when I left that company ITT, that was my last, what I would call, normal corporate job. And that's when I formed another company, Choi. And you ought to take a look at the website, by the way, because I do a lot of knowledge sharing on that, particularly with things like book reviews and newsletters. But that was a new thing for me. I was starting over, but I wanted to make these deeper connections. So I started writing book reviews that had to do with becoming a better leader or a better person. And in 2015, the very first person who I asked to send me a book, I decided, why just buy a book when I can ask the author? So in 2015, that's almost 8 years ago now, I reached out to this author named Susan Packard. I don't know who she is, but I just asked her if she could send me a copy of that book, New Rules of the Game. And she sent me a copy of the book, and I only realized later she's a pretty famous lady. She co-founded HGTV. She's a very smart marketing lady and basically a really neat lady. So she was the first one, because of that common connection, the common purpose. We've become friends now. In fact, she interviewed me for her second book. And I've only met her once, but I think she's a very special lady. And think about that. What an interesting way to connect with somebody. I'm using Twitter, right? I'm using Twitter, and she sends me copies of that book all the time. She'll sign them for me. New Rules of the Game is a book that's largely written for professional women. Her second book, I think, is even better. It's called Fully Human, and it's about emotional intelligence. So it's neat. So I realized I can start making connections with people, and it can happen anywhere in the world. So here's this last one I'll share with you. I went to PMI Australia in 2017. I was invited to come there and give a talk, not this talk, but a different talk. Now this is funny. So you see the conference speakers up there, right? You see a picture of Jim with more hair. So, but look at the lady next to me there. It turns out that lady, Michelle, now we didn't know this. She had written a book called Step Up, right? Now she lives in Melbourne. So she lives a lot closer to you than to me. And I asked her for a copy of the book. And this was in either late 2016 or very early 2017. So she sends me a book all the way from Australia, right? So that's not cheap, right? She packages up this book, she sends it to me. She knows I'm going to write a review. And we find out only after I review the book that we're going to be keynote speakers at the same conference. Isn't that crazy? So all these really interesting connections. And oh, by the way, so I met Michelle. I made sure, because I was giving that talk in Sydney and I took our daughter with us. I made sure I flew to Melbourne and I had breakfast with Michelle. And maybe a year or so later, she sends me a copy of her second book. And she said, I'm writing about you on page 96, because she's writing about what it means to have a leadership philosophy. And what I'm sharing with you, they're fun stories, and I've got many of them. But once we adopt this idea about connecting with people based on shared purpose or interest, and it's genuine, and we're interested in the other person, any kind of relationship can form. It could be a business relationship. It can be a relationship like this. And as a result, and this talk is the same thing. I believe I gave this talk to the PMI UK last year, and I think someone here found out about that, and that's why we're connected now. Think about that. I'm sitting in a room here in Tampa, Florida, around the world from you, and yet we've got this very interesting connection that we've made. So that's really the talk. Here are ways you can connect with me. You can do it through my company, Choink. I'll tell you right now, I would very much, if your company would like to do a leadership program with me, I have never been to Indonesia. I would love to come, and I could answer not just your questions, but we could have a really good program, and that could be another great place for me to visit. But anyway, those are ways to connect with me. Some of you have connected with on LinkedIn already. I will open up my network to you, but I think more than anything else, just like the questions in the chat box, I think that we can find a better way to connect with each other. I think we're thirsty for it today, more than ever. So that's the networking and leadership talk. And let's go ahead and answer any questions. We have plenty of time for that.
Okay. Please, if you have any question for participant, you can write on the chat box.
Mhm.
Or if we want to more interactive, can speak, yeah.
Yeah, raise your hand,
Yeah.
unmute, but you got me for 22 minutes if you want.
I think it's okay. So the networking is like a constant relationship, yeah, continuing.
So what are you wondering, Rishuli?
Yeah, not just only connecting, yeah, not only connecting, but there is sustain things to do, yeah. Not, oh, I have connect with you, but there is some, like you tell the story, but someone still send you some book like that. That's a interesting relationship, yeah.
It is. Here's what's been a surprise to me, because I didn't realize this when I was starting it. If somebody writes a nonfiction book, not just a story, I think it's impossible for someone to write a nonfiction book without actually telling you a lot about themselves. They'll tell you about the stories, they'll tell you their what happened in their professional life. So if somebody writes a couple hundred pages, and if I read that closely and I study it, I'm going to know I'm going to know a lot of things about that person, whether or not that's what they were trying to do. And then if I write a review about that, or if I have a conversation with them, I'm going to ask them questions based on what I read, and they're going to realize, wow, this person really knows me well. And that's a great way to start. Think about that. You can have a really interesting start to a relationship with someone that you've never met, simply because you read something very carefully that they did. In fact, I got a book in the mail yesterday from another author. It happens almost on its own now. Okay. All right. I hope it's not getting too late and everyone's ready for the weekend out there, but let's see who's got something to share. Who's got something, any questions at all? Any observations?
Okay. Everyone, if you have any question, please write on the chat box, or maybe you want to.
Here we go. You said we should focus on both people and result. What should be our priority when it doesn't match? That's a great question. That's a really good question. I don't think there's a single answer, but personally, I would probably lean on the people side. I think COVID's taught us that, but it's a good question. So for instance, let's say you write a leadership philosophy, and it says that the way you achieve success results is by investing in people as a priority, right? So providing the training, the experiences for them, all of that, the responsibility, all of that. And let's say you share that with your company or your supervisor, and they agree with you. Maybe they're not thinking, but they say, I agree with your leadership philosophy. And then a couple weeks later, someone's mad at you because you delegated a project to somebody who was very junior when there's someone more senior who could have done a better job. I think this is very realistic. And you might say, that's right. We could have this other person do it, but we're not training anybody new. And remember, my priority is to invest in people, because we continue to do that, we'll develop more skills, and then we have more options to get work done. And you could easily see that you could be in a conflict there, where you might have to remind somebody that the way you achieve results is by balancing those two. When you I have an opinion, company will choose leader who most focus on task or job. Is always talking about probability business growth. That's right. If you want to focus on people and results, you may be in a company that doesn't do both. Okay, you may find you don't want to stay there. So, but what's very interesting though, it says, at what level of leadership should we focus more on people? Here's what I've experienced in the United States, and I really like this question. Many times, someone will come to one of my 3-day leadership classes. We call it a leadership excellence course. And this is someone who probably has very similar educational credentials to you. Maybe they have a master's degree. Maybe they've been a successful project manager for 10, 15 years. And they'll come to my class sometimes because they're not getting promoted anymore. They're good at the results, but the people skills maybe aren't there. And so I believe that the shift to focusing on people and results should happen earlier than most of us think. And I think the earlier we realize that our path to success isn't just about our own credentials anymore, I think the earlier we do that, generally, the better. Certainly, if we could have that perspective by the time we become a supervisor for the first time, I think that's the best situation. How to grow the leadership of our team. Let's ask them more initiative or what, sir? Well, that question, Yanda, I think that's one of the reasons why we promote the development of a personal leadership philosophy. If you want to grow a team, if you want to really balance that focus on people and results, one of the greatest tools you can use for that is to write a personal leadership philosophy. And there's 8 components to that. And that's a good way to address your question. But to the question before, you're going to need to be an organization that actually supports you in doing that. If you're in an organization that cares only about numbers, then you may not be in the right place. You might not. But what I found is organizations in the States that tend to focus more on results than people, they have very high turnover right now. And sometimes they don't know why. There's many organizations. You remember I told you I'm coaching the president of a federal credit union right now. And here's what I think happened. He finished his first year last year, and I think he was very good at hitting the numbers for getting the results. And I think the trustees told him, you need to get a coach and you need to work on developing the team some more. And he was very ready to go. I think he was told, go get a coach. And I think that tells us that even at a high level, that you could be the president of a company, if you're not investing in people today, in this environment, COVID, post-COVID, you probably have big structural issues, and you're probably having a very hard time keeping people. At least that's what it looks like here in the States. Who else? These are good questions.
Yeah, interesting. Interesting answer too. Okay.
Keep in mind, if you want, find me on LinkedIn if you want. I know I'm connected with about 10 of you so far, but if you're in an organization, if you'd like to learn more about what we might want to do together, we could even do a virtual class if you want. I'd love to come out there, but if you want to explore a leadership experience with me, please find me on LinkedIn, especially if you've got an organization you think might benefit from doing something like this, because it could be a lot of fun. Could change your career too. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming to. Okay.
Last call. Anyone else?
Let's go. Okay, there is another question from Nazi.
In case we found another purpose and change to it, I thought the way we networking with others will change too. How to maintain our previous network? Well, that prior network is probably still there, but maybe the real challenge is to see if you can make it deeper, right? Is it a vocational network? Is it just people you know at work? Maybe the challenge is, can you take it deeper? Can it become something that's stronger, or let's say not just transactional? That's another really good question. I bet we've all had that happen before. We've had colleagues that we work together well, we appreciate each other, but maybe we don't know them as well as we could, right? Maybe we could know them a little bit deeper. I really like that question. I don't think it has to be replaced.
Okay.
Great questions. Okay. Almost 8:20.
It's okay.
All right, you folks tell me how to follow up. Okay, how to follow up. But I really enjoyed this. It's still the morning for me, so I've still got plenty to do today, but your day's almost over.
Yeah. Still in the morning, yeah, in Florida. Okay. Okay. I think if there is no
Thanks,
question,
everybody.
yeah. We have another the last agenda. Maybe we take the photo together.
Okay.
Everyone,
Okay.
please turn off your camera. Bisa dihidupkan kameranya. Jim, can you your slide? Maybe you can turn off your slide so we can get
absolutely.
yeah.
Yep. There you go.
Okay, Mas Bimo.
Okay, everyone. Open up your camera, smile. I will start taking pictures. We have several
A lot of
pages.
pictures to take.
I'm waiting for everybody to turn on their camera. Okay, I will start taking pictures.
How many page?
We have several pages. Moment. And then another pages. And last one. A moment, there's some technical issue. Yeah, then okay, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Jim. I think very much that we can take away tonight. Thank you for sharing, and everyone in here, thank you for your joining and participant. Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Cheers.
Every
Thank
nice
you,
weekend.
Jim, for your
Welcome,
time.
everybody.
Thank you, Jim. Thank
have a
you.
great weekend.
Have a good.
Thank you all.
Have a
Okay,
good.
Jim.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Jim. Have a nice weekend.
Thank you, Mas Raisuli. Makasih.
Thank you semua.